When we think of the Middle Ages, the image of a knight often shines the brightest armored warriors sworn to honor courage and loyalty. But how did someone transform from an ordinary boy, whether the son of a peasant or a young noble, into this admired figure? The answer lies in one defining moment, the knighting ceremony. It was more than a ritual, it was the gateway to a new life. The journey toward knighthood began long before the moment of the ceremony. At just 7 years old, a boy of noble birth would leave the comfort of his family home to serve as a page in another lord's household. Life as a page was not glamorous. He learned the basics of courtly manners, how to serve at the table, and how to carry messages. But these humble tasks were the first steps toward honor, discipline, and responsibility. By the age of 14, the boy would take on a new role squire. This stage was more demanding and far closer to the life of a knight. The young squire trained daily in riding horses, handling weapons, and learning the strategies of battle. He accompanied his knightly master into tournaments and sometimes even into war. The squire cared for armor and weapons, making sure they were polished and ready. Beyond physical strength, he was expected to master the art of etiquette, how to bow, how to speak, and how to carry himself with dignity. After all, a knight was not just a fighter, but a symbol of noble conduct. Not everyone who became a squire reached the rank of knight. The transition required more than age or training, it demanded proof of character. Some earned the honor after showing bravery in battle, others through years of faithful service. And in many cases, the final step came only when a lord or even a king chose to sponsor the squire. This patronage was crucial for knighthood, was both a recognition of skill and a gift of status. It is important to remember that the path was long and uncertain. A young man might spend over a decade preparing, always aware that failure, cowardice, or dishonor could end his hopes forever. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the ideals of knighthood blended practical military skill with the code of chivalry, creating a figure expected to be both a warrior and a moral example. By the time a squire was judged ready, he was no longer just a youth in training. He was a man standing at the edge of transformation, waiting for the sacred moment of the knighting ceremony to lift him into a new life. The knighting ceremony was never just about the young man receiving a title. It carried a deeper weight, both social and religious, that reached far beyond the individual. To be made a knight was to step into a role of responsibility before both God and the community. The knight was expected to uphold not only the honor of his family, but also the protection of the weak, the defense of the church, and the service of his lord. At the heart of this ideal stood the code of chivalry. It was more than a set of rules, it was a way of life. A knight swore to be loyal, to act with courage, and to treat others with respect. He was to protect women, children, and the helpless. He was to show mercy to the defeated and generosity to the poor. These promises gave the ceremony its moral depth. It was not enough to be skilled with a sword. One had to live as an example of Christian virtue. The church itself played a central role, for the ceremony was viewed as a sacred act. Blessings from priests and prayers for divine guidance reminded everyone present that knighthood was bound to faith. The young man was not only a warrior of his Lord, but also a soldier of Christ. The grandeur of the ritual, solemn prayers, processions, and the striking of the sword was meant to reflect this sacred duty. Every knighting was therefore a public declaration. It reminded all who watched that knights were not just fighters, but guardians of order, faith, and justice. This was why such ceremonies were carried out with such splendor. They were meant to impress, to inspire, and to affirm the sacred bond between the knight, his society, and his God. On the night before the ceremony, the young squire stepped into the most sacred part of his journey, the vigil. While the world outside carried on in noise and bustle, he entered the quiet of the chapel, where candles flickered against cold stone walls. This was no ordinary evening. It was the final test of the spirit before he could take his place among knights. The ritual began with a bath. To modernize, it might seem simple, but in the Middle Ages, it held powerful meaning. The water was a sign of purification, washing away sins and past mistakes, leaving the candidate cleansed for the life ahead. Emerging from the water, he donned a white tunic, the color of purity and innocence. This garment marked him not yet as a warrior, but as a soul seeking renewal. Then came the long hours of prayer. The squire would kneel sometimes for the entire night in front of the altar. Alone with his thoughts, he confessed his fears, asked for strength, and devoted himself to God's will. Imagine the silence of the chapel, broken only by the low chanting of priests or the sound of his whispered prayers. Every flicker of candlelight seemed to remind him tomorrow life would never be the same. This vigil was not about weapons or combat. It was about the heart. It tested patience, humility, and devotion. A young man might enter the chapel as a restless squire, but by dawn he was meant to rise with a renewed spirit, ready to carry the weight of the vows ahead. It was this blend of sacred ritual and emotional intensity that gave the knighting ceremony its depth. Before the clash of swords and the applause of nobles, there was this quiet, solemn night, a night that forged the soul of a knight. The dawn after the long vigil marked the most awaited day in a young squire's life. As sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, the church bells called nobles, clergy, and villagers together. The air was thick with expectation. Everyone knew they were about to witness a transformation not simply of a man, but of his very place in the world. The ceremony began with a procession. The candidate, now dressed in fine garments, symbolizing his readiness, entered the hall or chapel, accompanied by sponsors and witnesses. His steps were slow, almost trembling, yet filled with dignity. All eyes followed him. For the crowd, this was not just a ritual. It was a spectacle, a reminder of the values that bound their society together. Once in place, the squire recited the knightly oath. In a steady voice, he swore loyalty to God, to his king or lord, and to the code of chivalry. He promised to defend the weak, to fight for justice, and to protect the church. These words were not mere formality, they carried the weight of life and death. Breaking such a vow was unthinkable, for it meant not only dishonor, but eternal shame. Then came the heart of the ceremony, the accolade. The lord or king, holding a gleaming sword, stepped forward. The hall grew silent as the blade was gently placed upon the squire's shoulders, sometimes touching the head or alternating from shoulder to shoulder. The gesture was simple, but its meaning immense. With each touch of steel, the squire was no longer merely a servant in training, he was a knight. For many in the audience, this moment felt almost like magic, the passing of invisible power from one generation to the next. After the accolade, the new knight received the symbols of his station: a sword to fight with honor, a shield to protect spurs of iron or silver to mark his readiness for battle, and often a cloak that signified his new identity. These items were not just tools of war. They were sacred emblems of responsibility given in the presence of God and men. Each piece reminded him of the duty he carried from this day forward. The ritual did not end without the blessing of the church. A priest or bishop raised his hands in prayer, asking God to guide the knight's heart and steady his hand. The blessing bound the new knight not only to earthly service, but also to a higher calling. In the eyes of the medieval world, he was now both warrior and servant of Christ. Once the solemn ritual had ended, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The hush of prayers and the weight of vows gave way to music, laughter, and the sound of clinking goblets. A grand feast awaited the new knight, prepared not only to honor him, but also to share the joy with the entire community. Long tables groaned under roasted meats, fresh bread, and sweet pastries, while wine and ale flowed freely. Minstrels struck their lutes and harps, filling the hall with melodies. Dancers stepped lively across the floor, their movements bright and spirited, as though the very walls themselves rejoiced in the transformation they had witnessed. Noble guests exchanged gifts with the new knight, fine cloaks, ornate belts, or even a trusted war horse as tokens of respect and welcome into their circle. For the knight's family, it was a moment of pride displayed before all. This celebration was more than an indulgence. It was a public acknowledgement that the young man had truly become a knight, recognized not only by his lord and the church, but also by his peers and neighbors. In medieval society, honor was never private. It was affirmed in front of witnesses, and the feast sealed that recognition. The image of the knight often glimmers with romance, shining armor, noble deeds, and eternal honor. Yet behind that glow lay a reality far harsher. A knight's life was bound to warfare, with endless campaigns that brought exhaustion wounds and the constant threat of death. Disease swept through camps as ruthlessly as enemy blades, and even the strongest warrior could be undone by infection or famine. Beyond the battlefield, the weight of responsibility never lifted. Knights owed loyalty to their lords, protection to the weak, and obedience to the church. The code of chivalry was noble, but living up to it every day was a burden few carried without faltering. Some knights did embody those ideals, brave, merciful, and just. Yet history also remembers those who misused their power, turning their swords on peasants or seeking personal gain instead of honor. That is why the knighting ceremony was not an ending, but a beginning. The vows spoken in the solemn hall marked only the first step into a life of trials. For the young man newly raised, the real test came after the cheers faded, whether he would stand true to his oath or let the armor become nothing more than a hollow shell. So imagine yourself in that moment. Would you endure a cold, sleepless night of prayer, only to kneel before a sword at dawn, trading your freedom for the name of knight? For some, the honor would be worth every hardship. For others, the weight might feel unbearable. The knighting ceremony remains one of the most solemn and captivating rituals of the Middle Ages, a moment where faith, duty, and human ambition met. It reminds us that behind the shining armor stood an ideal, the timeless pursuit of honor and dignity.